On August 14, 1945, a woman named Helen was hanging laundry when the church bells started ringing, every single one in town at once. She didn't know why yet. In 4 minutes, she would. 7 a.m., a Tuesday like any other. It starts as an ordinary morning. That's the part people forget. Her name is Helen Walsh. She's 26 years old, living in a small house in Dayton, Ohio, with her 2 children, Margaret, age 4, and a son, Joseph, who is 18 months old. Her husband, Private First Class Robert Walsh, has been in the Pacific for 14 months. She hasn't seen him since June of 1944. Helen wakes at 7, same as every morning. The war has had a specific rhythm in her house for 3 years now. Ration coupons, a service flag with 1 blue star hanging in the front window, a routine built entirely around waiting. She makes oatmeal for Margaret. She doesn't think today is different. There's no reason to think that yet. She turns on the radio while she does the dishes, not for news, just for the company of a voice in the house. The announcer is talking about something ordinary. Crop reports, a baseball score. Nothing has happened yet. As far as anyone in this kitchen knows,
Allied forces continue their advance across Europe as rationing measures remain in place for the coming months. The weather for tomorrow looks fair with light winds across the region. In other news, local community events continue.
this is simply another Tuesday in a war that has lasted, by this point, for 3 years and 8 months. 9 a.m. The waiting. Helen has gotten very good at waiting. This is a skill nobody teaches you and nobody thanks you for. And almost every American woman with a husband overseas has had to learn it from nothing. She hangs laundry in the backyard. Margaret plays nearby with a doll that has a hand-sewn dress. Store-bought toys are hard to find. Most factories that made them are now making something for the war effort instead. Joseph naps in a basket on the porch. The last letter from Robert arrived 11 days ago. It was censored, black ink blocking out anything that might reveal his location. A strange kind of intimacy where her husband writes to her and a stranger in a military office reads it first and decides what she's allowed to know. He wrote that he was fine. He always writes that he's fine. She has learned to read past it, to look for the specific phrases that mean something is wrong, and the specific phrases that mean genuinely, today was an easier day. She doesn't know that as she pins a shirt to the line. Men on an island called Okinawa and aboard ships across the Pacific have already heard. She doesn't know that in Washington, in London, in a palace in Tokyo, the news has already moved through rooms full of powerful men for hours. Information in 1945 doesn't move at the speed of a feeling. It moves at the speed of telegraph wires and radio transmitters. And then it has to find its way down, neighborhood by neighborhood, to a woman hanging laundry in Ohio who has absolutely no idea that her entire life is about to change in the next 60 minutes. 9:47 a.m. The first sound. It's a church bell first. St. Mary's, 2 blocks over. Helen doesn't notice immediately. Bells ring for all kinds of reasons. But then there's a second bell from a different direction, and a third. And within 90 seconds, every church bell in Dayton, Ohio is ringing simultaneously. An overlapping, chaotic, beautiful noise that doesn't happen by accident and doesn't happen for anything small. Helen stops with a wet shirt still in her hands. A neighbor, Mrs. Pruitt, 3 houses down, comes out onto her own porch, looking confused in the same way Helen is confused. Then a car somewhere on the main road starts honking its horn. Not one short honk, a continuous, sustained honk the kind that only makes sense if the driver has both forgotten and stopped caring about how a car horn is supposed to be used. Helen sets down the shirt, walks to the side of the house where she can see the street. People are coming out of their houses. 9:52 a.m. It's over. A boy, maybe 12 years old, the paperboy, Helen recognizes him, comes tearing down the sidewalk on his bicycle, standing on the pedals, screaming something she can't make out at first. Then she catches it. It's over! The war's over! Japan surrendered! He's shouting it at every house, not stopping, the words tumbling over each other with the specific breathless urgency of a kid who has been handed the single biggest piece of news of his entire life and has been trusted somehow to deliver it. Helen doesn't move for 1 full second. Mrs. Pruitt is already crying. A man 2 houses down, older, missed the draft age, working in a factory, comes out onto his lawn and just stands there, hand over his mouth. Helen picks up Margaret, who has stopped playing and is staring at her mother with the specific alarm of a 4-year-old who doesn't understand what's happening, but understands instinctively that something enormous is happening. "Daddy's coming home," Helen says. She's not sure if she says it to Margaret or to herself. Margaret doesn't fully understand. She will be told this story for the rest of her life, that she was there, in the yard, when the war ended, and that she does not actually remember it. Not really, not the way her mother does. 10 a.m. The street fills. Within 10 minutes, Helen's street is unrecognizable. People are standing in their yards, on their porches, in the middle of the road. Somebody's radio has been carried outside, propped in an open window, the volume turned all the way up. And a voice, President Truman's, recorded earlier and now playing on every station simultaneously, is confirming what the paperboy already announced with significantly less ceremony. Japan has accepted the terms of surrender. The war, all of it, both fronts, 3 years and 8 months of it, is over. A neighbor Helen barely knows, a woman whose husband has been in Europe, comes across the street and simply hugs her. Neither of them says anything. They don't need to. Every woman on this street has been doing the same specific, silent arithmetic for years. How many more months? How many more letters? How much longer do I have to be this strong? And in the space of about 4 minutes, the math has changed completely for almost everyone, all at once, on a Tuesday morning in August. Not for everyone. Helen will learn over the coming days that 2 families on a nearby street received different news around this same time. Not a homecoming, but a telegram. The kind that starts with, "We regret to inform you." The war ending doesn't undo what already happened. It just stops anything else from happening. Helen knows this, even in the middle of her own relief. She holds Margaret a little tighter. 11 a.m., downtown. Word reaches Helen that downtown Dayton has become something she's never seen before, and she decides, almost without deciding, just moving on instinct, to see it for herself. She puts Joseph in the carriage, takes Margaret's hand, and walks the 8 blocks toward the center of town. What she finds is closer to a flood than a celebration. People are everywhere, in numbers that don't seem possible for a Tuesday morning. Strangers are embracing strangers. A serviceman home on leave, in uniform, is being lifted onto the shoulders of a crowd he's never met before in his life. Someone has climbed a lamppost and is waving a small American flag. And below him, people are throwing torn newspaper into the air like confetti, because nobody had actual confetti ready for this. How could they have? Nobody knew this morning would be the morning. Car horns are still going. A man is playing an accordion on the sidewalk, badly, joyfully. A woman Helen doesn't know grabs both of her hands and spins her once, laughing, and then moves on to the next stranger, doing the same thing. This is the part that's hard to explain later, Helen will think, years from now. It wasn't organized. Nobody planned it. It was just every single person in the city independently arriving at the exact same impulse within the same hour. And that impulse was, I have to find other people right now. I cannot feel this much alone. 1 p.m., the telegram Helen doesn't get. Helen walks home a different way, past the small Western Union office near the corner of 3rd and Main. There's a line outside it, not long, but present. Families waiting for word, for confirmation, for something specific with their husband's or son's or brother's name on it. Not just the general news that the war as a whole is over. Helen watches a young woman come out of the office, holding a yellow telegram against her chest, crying in a way that could be either kind of crying, and Helen genuinely cannot tell from a distance which one it is. And this fact will stay with her, that on this exact day, in this exact hour, the worst possible news and the best possible news were arriving in the same building, handed across the same counter by the same clerk. Helen doesn't go in. She has no reason to. Robert isn't due to be specifically accounted for yet. His unit's status isn't something she'll learn today. But she stands there for a moment anyway, holding Margaret's hand, watching the door, feeling something complicated that doesn't have a clean name. Relief that isn't quite finished. Joy with a thread of fear still wound through it. The war is over. That doesn't mean Robert is safe yet. That doesn't mean he's on a ship home yet. It means something has stopped. It doesn't yet mean what comes next. 3 p.m., the factory. Across town, the Dayton factories, many of them converted years ago from making cash registers and other peacetime goods into making parts for bomb sites, radios, and aircraft components, have stopped. Not stopped for the day, stopped, period, in a way that workers are only beginning to understand. The war contracts that have employed tens of thousands of people, many of them women who took factory jobs for the first time in their lives because the men were gone and the war needed hands, are ending. Today is a day of celebration. It is also, though almost nobody is thinking about this yet in the middle of the joy, the first day of an economic transition that will reshape this city and 100 cities like it. A woman named Dorothy, who worked the assembly line at one of these plants for the past 2 years, who learned to read blueprints and operate machinery she'd never touched before the war, who earned her own wage for the first time in her adult life, stands outside the factory gates with her coworkers, celebrating along with everyone else, and also quietly, wondering what happens to her job now that the men are coming home to want it back. This question doesn't have an answer yet. It will take months to even fully become a question people are willing to ask out loud. 5 p.m., home again.
Almost home, dear.
Helen makes it home by late afternoon, exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with physical tiredness. The house looks exactly the same as it did this morning. The laundry, still half pinned to the line, has dried in the August sun. The oatmeal pot from breakfast is still in the sink. Nothing in this house has changed. Everything in the world has changed. Helen stands in her kitchen for a moment, just looking at these two facts sitting next to each other, unable to fully reconcile them. She feeds the children dinner. Margaret asks, for the 4th time today, when Daddy is coming home. And Helen gives her the same honest, incomplete answer she's given every time. Soon, but not today, and I don't know exactly when.
I don't know, my love.
This is true. It will, in fact, be nearly 4 more months before Robert's unit is processed, transported, and finally discharged. December, not August. The war ending today doesn't mean the waiting ends today. It means the waiting has a different shape now, a shape with an actual end somewhere in it, instead of an unknown one. 7 p.m., the blue star.
Smells good. Here you go.
After the children are down, Helen sits for a while in the front room, where the small service flag still hangs in the window. White field, red border, one blue star in the center. The universal symbol that someone from this house is serving. Millions of these flags hang in windows across America tonight. Some of them, by morning, will quietly be taken down and replaced with nothing. Because the war ending means, for those families, that there's nothing left to mark. Their son or husband is already gone, has been gone for months, and the flag was the last visible thread connecting the house to him. For other families, gold stars, the symbol of a service member who died, will stay in windows for years, decades sometimes, long after the war is a memory and not a daily fact. Helen's flag still has its blue star. Robert is alive, as far as she knows. Today didn't change that fact. It changed what that fact means going forward. She sits with the flag and the radio playing low in the background, still covering the surrender, still replaying parts of Truman's announcement, still describing celebrations in cities she's never been to. And she lets herself, for the first time in 14 months, imagine a date. Not today, not next week, but an actual day, sometime, when a car will pull up outside this house and a man in uniform will walk up this path. And this specific kind of waiting will be completely, finally over. 9 p.m. The city that doesn't sleep tonight. Outside, the celebrations are nowhere near finished. Bonfires have been lit in some neighborhoods, small ones, improvised, fed with whatever scrap wood people can find. The downtown crowds from this morning have, if anything, grown. Servicemen home on leave are being bought drinks by strangers in every direction. A radio station has stayed on air far past its normal sign-off time, playing music and reading messages people are calling in. Short, joyful, sometimes barely coherent statements of relief, broadcast to the whole city. This kind of spontaneous, citywide, structureless celebration is happening in nearly every American city and town simultaneously tonight. New York's Times Square will become so packed with people that it enters photographs and newsreels, and, eventually, history itself, as one of the most famous single images of joy the century will produce. But the version happening in Dayton, Ohio, on Helen Street, in front of a Western Union office, outside a factory gate. These versions matter just as much to the people living them, even though no camera is there to record most of it. 11 p.m. The end of the day. Helen finally goes to bed close to midnight, later than she has in months. There's no instinct toward an early bedtime tonight, not with the radio still playing, not with the occasional firecracker or gunshot of celebration still audible somewhere across town. She lies in the dark in a bed that has been half empty for 14 months. She falls asleep with the blue star still in the window, the war finally over, and an entire new kind of waiting, hopeful, dated, almost finished, just beginning. On August 14, 1945, roughly 70 million Americans heard, within the same several hours, that the deadliest war in human history had ended. Some news you can simply tell by the sound of every bell in town ringing at once.